I'm a podcast producer now. What I do for a living is I elevate diverse voices, allow people to be seen and heard. I don't think that's a coincidence because I wasn't seen and heard at a time. So I'm so passionate about doing that now. Don't dim your light because for the comfort of others.
Hi, Ginni.
Hey, Natalie. I'm excited to be here.
I'm so excited you're here. Welcome to All Over Again podcast.
Thank you. I was a little nervous when I read your questionnaire because you're like, what would you do all over again? I'm like, oh, God, where do I start?
What would you do all over again? That's a great segue.
I think I was looking at certain moments in my life, Natalie. I was like, oh, I could have done that this way, or this could have happened this way, or my parents could have made a decision to make things happen this way, or maybe things would have been different. But I think I landed on something that was like an overarching kind of theme or message for me, which was if I could do something all over again, I would have freed myself from the cultural trauma and barriers that comes with being born into a brown family. And by brown, I mean, and this is just my experience, I'm Sri Lankan born. My family is from Sri Lanka. We migrated to Australia when I was 2. But the culture follows you everywhere. The beliefs follow you everywhere, regardless of where your postcode is or where your mailing address is, right? So I thought to myself, oh, if I didn't carry that with me, I think my life maybe would have ended up the same, but I would have been freer sooner.
So let's talk a little bit about what that means. Like, what are some of the cultural conditions that you grew up with that have molded why you felt like you had to be certain ways?
So I think the first thing that I learned as a kid was that everything in your life about you is predicated on, oh, but what will people think? That's the first belief that was taught to me. And I don't think it was necessarily intentional. I think it was just I energetically inherited it, and also the way that people were behaving around me, adults especially. I was like, oh, I see, this is what happens. And this came particularly from my mother. So my mother was diagnosed with bipolar before I was born. And in Sri Lanka, having a mental illness is still stigmatized. Back then, I could imagine in the 70s and 80s with my mother, she would have probably gone through a lot more stigma than what people would go through now. And then, she was pregnant with me. They were moving to Australia. And I don't think people understood what bipolar disorder was or mental illness was in Sri Lanka. So even in medicine, the treatment for mental illness was electric shocks, which my mother had 2 of them. So things like that, obviously when you talk about people, this person had 2 electric shocks, the shame that's created around that, the energy of shame is like, oh yes, this is what we're going through, and then the judgments come. So even before I was born, the stage was set. And then we moved to Australia, and then, it was then soon discovered that my mother was actually having an affair with someone else. So you have a mentally ill woman having an affair who's pregnant with a child who's apparently my dad's, which I am, just to clarify, not the man that she was having an affair with. But all of that stuff, it landed on so many judgments on my mother. And my mother was just trying to figure life out with the resources she had, with the capacity that she had, with the lack of support that she had. So that kind of set the stage for, we're going to have a very interesting life from here. Because even moving to Australia, that whole stigma, that whole, what are people saying about us, did not change.
Did you know all of these things? Was it shared? Was there sort of no secrets within the family? Like, how did you know all of these things from such a young age?
So when I was, it was 2 when we moved to Australia. And I noticed my mother would make phone calls at night. And I'm like, I wonder what that's about. But as a kid, you don't really read into things. You don't know how to, right? You are curious, but you don't investigate because you're too busy watching Batman or something like that, which is what I was doing.
And no context.
Exactly. No context.
Right.
I'm like, interesting. And I'm like, she's calling someone darling. So I'm like, don't know what that is. And then one night she said, we're packing our bags, we're leaving. I'm like, is Dad coming? She's like, no, because my dad did night shift. He's a nurse. So the way my mum handled that, it wasn't the best way to, I think in hindsight, to leave someone. I think a conversation should have been a little bit more less dramatic, but less traumatic for my dad, because my dad came home to pretty much an empty house. His wife and his 2 children were gone. He's like, what the hell happened? So that was a lot for him. But again, it's the whole it was a complete avoidance of a certain issue that was going on because they were so ashamed of, oh, she's having an affair. Oh, she's got a mental illness. Let's just figure this out where it's like secret. So it's all these things that kind of ripple through, Natalie. And I think, you know, as a kid, I sensed energetically something was off. I just couldn't put it into words. And then when we moved to a new place and my dad wasn't there, I was like, what's going on here? So, yeah.
Traumatic for you. I mean, 100%. I'm listening to you say, yes, of course, traumatic for your father, but traumatic for you and your sister.
Yeah. Because we went to this new place. We were living in Fairfield in Melbourne. Then we moved to Northcote, which was a 2-bedroom place. And I'm like, oh, Dad's not here. Nothing's been really explained or you know, told to me. My sister, obviously, she's 11 years older than me. So she had some idea of a more articulate and a more kind of processed version of what happened. And I'm sure she was going through what she was going through. But you can't confide in a 4-year-old, right? And vice versa. Because the 4-year-old didn't know what was going on. So when we got there, my mum's like, you're going to get a new dad. And I'm like, oh. And then incoming my stepfather moved to Australia within a matter of months. And then after my parents were divorced, probably more years. The timeline's a little blurry. But yeah, that was interesting because here my mother was trying to kind of trailblaze. I don't want to use the word trailblaze, but she was trying to probably find a life of happiness for herself. But I think there were certain poor decisions made due to her illness and due to a lack of support and probably support. And she was just naturally just a determined person. And these situations led to so much trauma for us, which was, whether it be unintentionally, it was just kind of glossed over.
There's a lot to unpack there, Ginni.
Yeah.
Of course. I mean, that is a lot. Mm-hmm. And so did you ever have the discussion at any given point from, obviously not at age 4, but from that point ever in your lifetime with your mom, were you able to unpack that with her?
Absolutely. I think the hard thing for me was I was getting versions from other people before I had the conversation with her, before I could, because having bipolar, she had relapses. Even though she was medicated at certain times, she had relapses. And then there are moments of your mother where you get to experience her for her, aside from the illness and so it's like a really interesting kind of multidimensional person I was mothered by, right? Mm-hmm. There was this doting, loving, protective mother. And then there was this person who was like irrational and then didn't listen and didn't want to do anything that you told her to do and didn't accept she was sick. But then all of that, like as a kid, you're like, that's my mum. Like you don't know any different, sure. Right? So when I was growing up, you know, my sister told me her version of the story. She's like, well, mum cheated. This happened. My dad, I heard his version from my sister as well. And then there were bits that I was piecing together, but it was just so much that I think for me, all around that, people were like, but don't talk about it. Because all of this stuff, you can process it, but don't talk about it to anybody else because we don't want people to think that your mum's, you know, promiscuous in any way or she's incapable or anything like that. So it was a lot going on. And I think I look back at it and I'm like, oh, like if this was done differently, what would change for me? If, you know, people were a little bit more open to mental illness, would my mum be more supported? Sure. So these are the things that came up for me in that session.
But how did it affect you? I mean, that seems like a heavy layer of shame that you had to contend with. And if there was shame, how did that show up for you throughout your life?
So many moments, Natalie. I remember, so my mum married my stepfather and he unfortunately was an alcoholic. So my mum went through a lot of verbal abuse from him. So I grew up around that. And I think to myself, oh gosh, now I can call it what it is. It's verbal abuse, it's emotional abuse. When I was a kid, you don't know those terms. You're like, they're fighting a lot. That's how I could express it as a 7-year-old. And then when they got divorced, my sister got married pretty early. And then I was actually molested by a family member. And then I haven't really shared this publicly, but that's when the shame manifests because it's not that, okay, this child has been violated. It's this child's been violated and let's not talk about it. So that's the shame that I think in brown culture that is really toxic because they don't look at who's been wronged, what the deed is. It's like, oh, something's happened, it's bad, we don't want people to know about it. And I think that's what's really the toxic part about the culture. So, I mean, a lot of things happen after that point too, but it's just, this is a very common theme I hear in the culture that I'm from. It's the secrecy, the shame, we don't want to talk about what's really going on.
Oh my God, Ginni, did your family believe you? Please say they did.
Yeah,
Please.
So my mother believed me, but some family members believed me, some didn't. I think some people thought, oh, Ginni's mum's crazy, she probably fed her the lie. And, this escalated pretty badly. Like, it went to court. There were people against each other. There was a lot of family dynamics where some people didn't believe me. And the guy got not guilty, the verdict.
You're kidding me.
So he's still out there. And that's another story, another podcast. But the problem is that whole time, nobody protected me. And I think that part was just completely overlooked.
Not even your family.
Well, I think my mother, this is the thing where I look at this from where I am now. Like, my mother has since passed, and I look at it, I think my mum did everything she could within her power to protect me. When she found out, she had a mental breakdown. She was hospitalized. I had to stay with my aunt for a couple of weeks, or 6 weeks, I think it was, when she was in hospital. But she didn't look after herself enough in the time where I was being molested. Because what do predators do? They see vulnerability and they're like, oh, I'm going to take advantage of this. I'm going to groom. This is how I can be a predator, right? So I think in that way, my mother had that breakdown because she realized, oh, I didn't protect you at that time because I didn't look after myself and my mental health. And the other part, how that kind of manifested over my childhood, was that she then turned into this overbearing, overprotective mother. Like, anywhere I went, she needed the phone number of my friend's house I was going to. If I didn't call when I got there, she'd call the parents. It'd be this whole thing. I laugh about it now, but sometimes her protectiveness was a lot. And sometimes the part that was hard was, instead of her getting support from anyone saying, this must be a lot for you to also handle, she was shamed for that too. It's like, oh, you're spoiling your daughter, or you're doing this. And like, it's all these layers, Natalie. So I think this is all stemming from cultural baggage and cultural beliefs.
And sounds generational.
Generational as well. Absolutely. Yeah.
And your relationship with your sister?
So my relationship with my sister has been, she went through, we grew up in the same household. We went through similar things. We're very different in certain ways. And in some ways, I do see us being similar in that there is a lot of trauma that I am unpacking in therapy, obviously. And to be able to operate in the world that I do, a therapist is needed. But I think for my sister too, my relationship with
Everyone needs therapy. Everyone needs therapy.
Totally agree. And I think if that was embraced more in Sri Lankan culture, therapy, rather than people having a judgment about therapy, gosh, the life people could have, the healing people could experience. My we're close. We are close. She lives in Australia, obviously. And my niece, I adore. She's like she's my homegirl. But I think my relationship with my sister was strained when that stuff was going on, because it was just very splintered. Everything was split apart and torn apart, and I didn't really want to sometimes look at that. And I was really scared as a kid, because when I was going through that, it wasn't about what happened to me. It's like, you need to protect this person, you need to say this, you need to not say this. So I had to really go back into the past, reverse engineer everything that I thought and felt. And I'm still going through things. I'm like, oh, this is your fawning, Ginni. This is what when you're in a moment in relationships, like prior to the one I'm in now, like when I'm in a moment, I'm like, oh, you're fawning, you're people pleasing, you're putting them first before your needs. You're not really thinking about what's happened to you. And that manifests in other areas of your life too, not just relationships. So again, these are things that I look at and I'm like, oh, this is all from what I grew up with. And it's so important.
It also feels, as you're speaking, it's very typical female behavior to people please.
Mm-hmm.
And different circumstances, I am a recovering people pleaser too. Yeah. I think most women will share that they are people pleasers or 100%. Are recovering in some ways. I'm hoping that my daughter will not be a people pleaser. And when I see instances of it in her behavior, it really bothers me. And my reaction, I have to step back from sometimes and realize, okay, wait, this is about me. This is not about her. But the people pleasing thing, I believe, is conditioned as a very female attribute, to serve, to make sure everyone is comfortable, to put everyone ahead first, right? Magnified by your very traumatic experience of not being seen or heard or supported. I mean, that these are things that no child should ever have to go through. And if they do, your comeback is truly inspiring. And you broke the generational cycle. I mean, look, you are in a beautiful, healthy relationship with Aaliyah. How did you break the generational trauma and the cycle? And also, when we get there, I'd love to hear how you came out too, right? Because that is
another thing,
another part that I can't imagine would be so widely accepted.
Yeah.
So
the question of how did I get from the relationships I had to the relationship now? So I don't want to be that person to take on that victim mentality and be like, oh, it was all them. Because I think definitely I contributed to how I people please and fawned in my relationships in my 20s, even in my early 30s. It was, I think, one of the most significant relationships I had in my 20s. This person was emotionally abusive too. Now I realize that. However, I didn't have that sense of boundaries or protection for myself. So what does someone who has grown up with that lack of protection or sense of boundaries do? They will put themselves in situations that are unsafe. And it doesn't necessarily mean physically unsafe, emotionally unsafe too. So this person I was in a relationship with, you know, there was cheating, there was this toxic back and forth with their ex, and I was like, oh, I'm just waiting for her to... That sort of stuff now, I'd be like, hell no. That would not, because I have learned boundaries and I've learned how to be protective of myself, and I've learned how to parent that part of me that was like, oh, but this person seems safe. It's like, no. Just because you love someone doesn't mean that love will give you that protection that you seek. And that's what I learned too, that because I was taught as a kid, you love this person, they're supposed to protect you, but they're not, but you just go along with it as a kid. So I realized, oh, there's this pattern that keeps showing up. Why am I in this on and off, up and down relationships constantly? And I got to my 30s and, you know, when I moved to New York, you know, relationships I had then too, it wasn't on and off, up and down, but there were definite elements of me losing myself in what I really wanted. So that was, I guess, the next level of development for me. I'm like, well, this relationship isn't really giving me what I need, even though I'm going along and painting this picture of, oh, it's a great relationship. Really, like, I think about what I needed, and then the moments where I felt not supported, I'm like, this is not what I need. And then I started having therapy, and then, you know, I started dating someone, and they were like, okay, I'm now discerning between what I need, what's healthy for me, and what I really want. And that's when I met Aaliyah. I think I went through a lot of probably the most difficult 2-3 years of my life, losing my mom, COVID, everything like that. And I realized in therapy, a lot of what I was running from was unpacking those 6 years of my childhood, which was so intensely filled with trauma and betrayal and lack of protection and all the things. But I think what I've learned in therapy, Natalie, and what I'm still learning is to really, like, the people pleasing, right? To really catch myself when I'm doing that and where it's coming from. Am I trying to seek approval? What is it in this person that I'm trying to please so much? And if they don't like me, why am I trying so hard? You know, like, why do we do that? Like, I know we all want to be liked, but why am I trying so hard here? I don't have to do that anymore. As a kid, I felt like I needed to, but I don't have to do
You needed to survive. Exactly. It actually served you.
Yeah. Now it doesn't serve me.
Right.
It doesn't, because I think we need to remind ourselves sometimes, especially those of us who've had that trauma as a child, we're conditioned as children to be like, oh, this is what life is going to be like. They're in charge. But when we are an adult, we can be like, actually, no, we're in the driver's seat. That your inner child can sit in the passenger seat and you can be like, you can chill. I got this. We don't have to go through this again.
Right. The parent can actually be the parent.
Exactly.
So the child doesn't feel... Did you feel like you had to parent at times?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this kind of came up for me when my mother passed. When I got the call from my sister, I was living in New York at the time. She called me in March of 2021 saying, "Mum's at end of life. You need to come." So Australia had the quarantine law where if you land in Australia, you have to quarantine in a hotel for 14 days. That was I think that was the most weirdest experience of time I've ever had, Natalie, because you're on a flight, you know there's an end to someone that you care about's life. So you're going through all those motions. Then the other part of the uncertainty is it's like this emotional purgatory, right? It's like, oh, I'm going to get to Australia, but my mum might die, but you may not see her before she dies because you're stuck in a hotel for 14 days until you're able to be back in society. Weird. So I got to Australia.
Insane in retrospect, isn't it?
It is. Was in the hotel, and you look outside, and the weird thing was everybody outside the hotel, no one was wearing masks. Life just looked normal. But then I look at my, 500 square feet hotel room, and I'm like, this is going to be my home for the next 14 days. And then every day I wake up, I think, is Mum dead? Is she gone? What's happening? So it's almost like I was sent to this emotional detention, really, like to process things. So time was going by so slow some days, time was going by so fast some days. And then some days it got to like day 8 and I'm like, why am I even getting changed? Like, who am I going to see? Like all these routines and habits I learned as an entrepreneur, I'm like, why am I getting up at 6 a.m. to go where? To the gym? Like, no, I can't. I have to do push-ups or whatever it might be. So that was really, really tough for me. And I remember going through that process and I got a call from a relative going, oh, could you call your niece? She's stuck inside all day. It's school holidays. Can you call her to let her go outside? And a part of me thought, yo, do you know where I am? I'm stuck inside and I can't go out for 14 days, period. And my mother's dying. Like there's just things like that. And when I left hotel quarantine, it became very much about, oh, Ginni, you need to go look after this person. Or Ginni, you need to go look after, and Ginni, you should move back to Australia now that your mother's gone. You need to be there for your sister and your family. I'm like, do you know how many relatives I have back in New York? 0. Do you know how many cousins my sister has in Melbourne? 33. She's good. That's right. Just cousins, not even aunts. She's good. It was just this whole people-pleasing thing and the whole, oh, you're the youngest daughter. You don't have you're not married, so you need to go sacrifice your life that you've built in New York, bring it all over here just so you could look after someone who really did not need looking after.
I have to ask, when you got out of quarantine, by the way, were there laws that said that if you were stuck in quarantine or that you left quarantine, there would be like legal ramifications?
Yeah, so quarantine in Australia, so when you're in hotel quarantine, there was a security guard on every floor.
Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah, so
that's insanity.
So when you got your food, it was like prison. They'd knock on your door. You have to wait 30 seconds. You open the door, you have to take your food, and you have to close the door within 30 seconds.
That is ridiculous. I can't. So please tell me that your mom was still...
Yes. So when I left hotel quarantine, she was still alive. I got to spend 11 days with her before she passed.
I'm so sorry that it was cut short by those 2 weeks.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that you had some time. There's no but. I am glad that you got to spend some time.
And it's weird because the 14 days went by so slowly, but the 11 days went by so fast. It's just a weird experience of time, right? And then you're going through that really quick time, then someone's time ends. And then you have this blur of relatives coming in, people who knew her, and you're experiencing her in different ways that you didn't know about. And then, it's like, oh, you've got to, again, this whole thing of you got to be there for your family. I remember I didn't really grieve my mum's death. I mean, obviously when she passed, I was sad and I was making the funeral arrangements, and I just had to be the person to be like, all right, you got to do this now. You got to plan this. And I think when you take on that role, your grief, your emotions gets put aside. When I got to New York, that's when it hit me. I'm like, this is a thing now, and this is the reality. So I did get to spend some time with my mum, and I think me and her had a relationship where even though it's ups and downs and it's trials and tribulations, she confided in me a lot. She told me things that I think that were really important for me at the end. Like she always told me, this is how I want to die. Like she told me her whole funeral plan. She didn't write anything. And then, when we're planning this, like, well, she told me this is how she wants to die. She said she wanted to die with my sister and myself on each of her sides, which she got that wish. And she wanted to be buried, and she goes, please make sure I'm actually dead. So I had this little joke with her. I'm like, I was poking, I'm like, are you really dead? Blink if you're not dead. I'm like, okay, you're good. Yeah.
And I mean, like, this is so relatable on so many levels.
Yeah.
And it's so hard. It's so hard to lose a parent. You had the confidence of knowing that you were delivering on her wishes.
Yeah, exactly. And that's that sometimes at the end is so important, you know.
Isn't it interesting after death, it's this time that sort of stands still, like everything else is moving around you, but everything in your body, time feels still, or at least that was my experience. I felt like it was like that for the first week. I don't know where the week went. And then even after that, it was so nebulous. Like, what do you mean I have to do this? Like, I can't, mentally, emotionally, or physically do that right now. Mm-hmm. Every task seemed so much harder. And then I flipped a switch into like, oh, this is go time. I have to do these steps. These are the things. Oh, this got real. I have to shelf my grief.
Exactly. I think you worded that perfectly. It's just like, okay, grief needs to go here for now because I need to do this, and this. It's so true because things did feel for me very hard. I remember telling my team, I'm like, listen, I'm going to be on and off. I had an assistant at the time. She was great in checking in with me going, nothing's on fire. This is what I need from you. And the company ran fine. Like, we were still operating. But what I found really difficult was the 11 days up until my mum died, I didn't sleep well. Like, I'd go home and I'd wake up like, is she alive? It's that anxiety, right? And even after she passed, I still woke up like, oh, and I don't think I slept well.
Was it real? Like, of course.
Did I dream it? Is this really happening? And then the other element of grief where like you have to tell people the story like all over again. It's like, this is what happened when she died. And I'm like,
and people ask the weirdest things.
I do. It's like, and then people also say the weirdest things. It's like, this is not helpful.
Comfortable.
And it's also like, let me grieve. And also, I'm not your audience right now for your theory on why you think it's a good thing my mother died. It's like,
right.
Chill, bro.
Oh, she's in a better place and da. It's like, no.
Say that
I'd
for
rather
you.
Her be with me.
Exactly.
Or him with me, right? Like, in my case, it was my dad. Yeah, grief brings up a lot. One of the most interesting things that I've encountered recently, I have a friend who is a social worker who is also a teacher, a professor at a local university. One of the things that is so impressive is that she went through her own experience with death and grieving with her father. And so she developed a course around it, which I thought was really fascinating. And something I've noticed that she's started doing when we get together with friends for birthdays. She's all about birthdays. And I really love that because I've always been one to be like, oh, birthdays don't matter for me, but they do for everyone else. Yeah. People pleasing, I'm sure. Yeah. And part of it, like not wanting to be in the spotlight too. Yeah. One of the things that she does, which is so interesting to me, is she asks everyone to go around the room and share right then and there a story or why the birthday person is so important to them. Right. And I love that because she is sharing sort of the things that matter about that person to their face while they're still with us.
And able to hear it.
Yes.
100%.
And I love that. And I thought, wow,
that's beautiful. Yeah,
right?
Because why say all the nice things when they can't hear it?
Right. I mean, or we're not sure
if they can hear it.
And that's so interesting. And I think that goes back to our culture of you just press on, you just keep going. And I think that although the veil is sort of lifting on mental illness, on certain things in this country, I mean, I know it's still different in other countries. I can't speak for that. Yeah. But it feels like in some ways, yes, our ability to use our voices is so important. But then there's also like the extent of the extra wokeness that is like, whoa, again, another conversation for another day. Yeah. But, okay. So speaking of being able to be authentically you and be the person who can live authentically yourself, what was it like to come out in a culture like yours? I mean, I'm shifting gears entirely.
No, I love this question.
Why? How did you do that? And what was it like when you shared with your family that you were in love with a woman or you liked women?
So the interesting thing about this was there were parts of my culture, because I think I'd suffered so much as a kid about it. I almost disassociated myself with the culture. I'm like, even though I am Sri Lankan, there's parts of the culture I'm rejecting, because I was, though when we moved to Australia, my values were very much shaped and coloured by a lot more, I guess, of the Australian or Western culture. My mother had certain traditions she wanted to bring back that she brought back from Sri Lanka. So I remember from like when I became a teenager and I started developing feelings for like some of the teachers that I had, and they were all female. But I knew, this is going to sound really strange, Natalie, I knew from the age of 4 that I liked women. And this was the splinter in the I guess the story, because when in my head I'm thinking, they're going to think I'm a lesbian because I was molested. They're going to think, she's this because this happened. And I'm like, regardless of this happening, this would have happened anyway. This is who I am, right? So all these theories, and then it goes back to, but it's also the way she was parented, and also the way, like, again, this whole thing, right? This whole loaded theory as to my sexuality. Oh, that's why she plays sports, or that's why she has this build. And like,
why does it matter? Why are people making excuses?
Exactly. It's like, I don't, exactly. It sounds like excuses. It sounds like excuses. Like, I don't need you to excuse or justify this. And I remember, thank you. And I remember like when I was 18, when I left Catholic school, I was like, okay, I don't have to be chained to the confines of their ethos.
Oh my gosh, and that must have been unreal.
A Catholic girls' school, when you're a pimply kid going through sexuality and who you're attracted to, it can be brutal.
I can only imagine.
It can be brutal. I'm very grateful I have
all girls school,
all girls Catholic school. I'm very grateful for my best friend, who's still my best friend. She's bridesmaid at my wedding. She was very supportive and was very authentically herself. So it helped me feel like I could be authentically me and share things with her. But when I turned 18, I started going to, the gay clubs, and I joined a radio station, which was an LGBT radio station. And I felt I came into my own voice, literally and figuratively. And I got invited to, host different shows, and then I got into TV. And I remember this was a turning point. So I was kind of having not that I was having a side life or anything like that, but I was being me, but not putting it back to I was trying to separate myself as much as possible from my culture and my family and all the things that I just like, I know there's something wrong here, but I don't want to deal with you right now. I'm just trying to figure out me. So I remember I went on TV one day, I was hosting a segment, and one of my aunts and uncles tuned into the TV show. Now, it's a gay TV program, it's very clear. They were watching it, and for some reason, they heard me say, which I don't think I said, oh, my name is Ginni and I'm a lesbian. Apparently, I outed myself, which I don't think I've ever done, because there's no need to do that when you're on a gay program, and no need to do that, period, right? But also I'm like, okay, so you're watching gay TV on a Monday night. Let's unpack that on another day, because why would you be doing that?
They didn't know that you were on?
They didn't know I was on. But why? But they knew it was a gay program to watch it. The whole time. It was very obvious it was a program for the LGBT community.
Sure, but sure.
Yeah. So I'm like, why were you watching gay TV on a Monday night persistently? Again, another discussion, Natalie. But then they were like, oh, so she's gay. My auntie started calling everybody. Did you know Ginni's gay?
Why didn't she just call you?
Oh, no, you don't do that in the culture.
Why?
You talk about everybody, but not to the person.
Oh my gosh, how infuriating and so complicated.
And then my sister got a call. Yeah. My sister got a call because my dad got a call from someone. My dad didn't talk to me. He went to my sister saying, hey, what's this about Ginni being gay? Like, this is not cool. And then my aunt called my sister saying, hey, you might get a call from people about this.
Your sister knows.
My sister knows. Cool. My sister at the time, I think this was big for her, because nobody's dealt with the only gay in the village in my family. I was the OG gay there.
There were, I'm sure,
there might be
people that had right? That were in that community, but
Maybe.
couldn't be.
Exactly.
Because
it's criminalized over there. It was.
it really?
At the time, 2013. It was. I think now I'm not quite up on my Sri Lankan law, but they are passing, or they're looking at it they're looking to at least decriminalize it, you know. Gay marriage is another story, but decriminalization, that's the first step, right?
That just sounds so
Yeah. So I
archaic.
remember my sister saying to me, hey, look, I don't mind, this is who you are, but you doing this in public, that's no. So essentially what she was saying was, and I have compassion for my sister, she was just trying to, I think one way she was being protective of me, she didn't want me to be judged or want me to be like ridiculed or anything like that. And the other part of her, I think she was just scared, like, what's going to happen from here? People are going to start judging all of us now.
Sure.
And so she's also a product of that cultural conditioning too. So I feel that. I remember when she said that to me, I had to go film a segment for that TV show. All the way in the car, Natalie, I was crying, going, I'm going to have to give up something I really love. And it's not about a person. It's about who I am. I'm a podcast producer now. What I do for a living is I elevate diverse voices, allow people to be seen and heard. I don't think that's a coincidence because I wasn't seen and heard at a time. So I'm so passionate about doing that now. But at the time, I remember thinking, gosh, like, I've got to stop doing this. I couldn't imagine doing it. And I remember I was going to meditation school at the time and I spoke to the meditation teacher about it and I said, my sister wants me to do this. And she's like, no, don't dim your light because for the comfort of others. Like, you shouldn't have to do that. And had I had not had that person kind of step in and say that, I think I probably would have listened. So here we are 14 years later.
And that is so fascinating because I always wondered how it was that you showed up, right?
Yeah.
So publicly, I didn't know all the nuances. I thought that you were showing up publicly and had to hide so much of who you are.
Yeah.
And so it was very bold of you to be able to show your alliance, if you will, with one part of you, right? I mean, listen, I'm all about being vulnerable when the time is right.
Yeah.
But like those other elements of your trauma, like nobody has any business to know then or now, quite frankly, unless you're comfortable sharing it. And it's amazing that you've come so far. You've built an entire platform around elevating other people's voices. So when was the moment that you were saying to yourself, okay, I'm going to flip from being an on-camera personality to supporting, and you're still an on-camera personality with your podcast. Yeah. I'm going to flip it over to supporting other people. When was the moment that you thought, this is it for me? I need to have this agency.
It's interesting you say that, Natalie, because I look back and I'm like, there never was a moment where I consciously did that. It was just, I was just going with the flow, especially when I moved to New York. As cliched as it sounds, I felt that New York City was one of the first energies in my life that I experienced that was completely unapologetically themselves. Seriously, you go out into New York, you see rats, you smell different things, you hear different things. New York is unapologetically itself. The grit, everything.
1,000%.
The lights, the celebrity, everything it's new. And I felt like it gave me permission to grow into me when I moved here. And then I look back now, I'm like, oh, connecting the dots, as Steve Jobs would say. I'm like, this is why you're doing what you do, because of what was not given to you. You weren't given a platform to share or be seen or heard. So let's give that to others. So I think there wasn't necessarily a realization or aha moment. I was just doing it. And then my mind caught up later, like, oh, that's why you're doing what you do. Duh.
Everyone should live in New York City. But, right?
Exactly. 100%. That's what I say.
But I see the purpose thread now.
Yeah.
I didn't know why you had a podcast platform, and now I know why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That is incredible. And it sounds like once you started to become unapologetically you, the flow kept happening.
Yeah. Found that when I came here and I actually didn't physically have my family around me. I mean, yes, when I went back to Australia, I saw elements of the people pleasing and the trauma come up. But when I came here, I could just really just breathe and unpack all of that without them there. Like all the trauma I went through, how I really feel about it. I could actually ask myself, how do you actually feel about this? Whereas before I was just flicking the switch. I was like, I got to go. I got to keep doing. I got to keep moving. But moving here, it just allowed me to really carve out space for myself. Yes, in a very expensive New York City rented apartment, but it's my space, right? Exactly. And I was just able to really just check in with myself. I felt like New York for me, probably people wouldn't think of New York as a place you go to for a retreat, but I felt like it was the place where I really like allowed myself to find myself again and really think about and ask myself the questions that I wish I was asked as a kid, you know? Yeah.
That resonates.
Yeah.
I think that New York City is that place. At least it was for me too. I feel that deeply.
Yeah.
So knowing what you know now,
Yeah.
what is something that you would share with everyone who is listening to our conversation right now?
I would say if you're not being heard or seen, you've got to allow yourself to be heard or seen. And that sounds very cliched, but I think if I could do things all over again, I would firstly just take myself away in whatever way I knew, whether it would be with a friend. Like I had as I said, my best friend was great. In that space, check in with yourself, allow yourself to be seen, because you're not going to be seen or heard in your environment that may be your circumstance, but as an adult, you've got to start seeing and hearing yourself for other people too as well. I think that's got to be your compass. So I think that's what I would share.
So it goes full circle.
Goes full circle.
Ginni, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Natalie. It was great. It was a great interview. I've never shared these things before, so it's a first.
Thank you for sharing so deeply. I am so honored that you would share so much about yourself on my podcast.
Of course.
It means the world.
Of course. Thank you.
Oh,
Thanks, Justin.
come here.
Thanks,
I love
Natalie.
you.
Love you. Thank you so much. You're so easy to talk to.